There are some times when you want to create some depth with your interface, whether it's extremely subtle and things are just gently raised off the screen, or it's completely overt and you have floating tiles and things that are pressed in. But either way, there is a principle that is a great place to start, and that is that light comes from above. Whether you're outside or indoors, typically there is going to be overhead lighting, and it naturally casts a shadow downward. Sometimes it comes from an angle, and I know that during sunset and sunrise, there can be a very horizontal light source with really long shadows being cast. But in general, it's a good principle to start with a light at the very top and let that dictate the way that highlights and shadows and gradients all kind of come into play. So let's take a quick look at a few older examples of mine back in the iOS 6 and pre-iOS 6 era when things were a lot more skeuomorphic. So right here, this is an iPhone app for a magazine called 8 Days, and this was the side navigation. And look, there is just tons of lighting effects going on. We've got gradients in the header here. We've got a recessed icon with very subtle drop shadows and inner shadows. I've even got subtle gradients on these icons, big gradients on these dividers with a pretty heavy kind of a embossed kind of beveled edge here with a shadow cast, very subtle. And these icons have a bit of a gradient with an inner highlight on the top, dark kind of recessed indented tab that lets me know this is the one that's been selected. Even these grooves in the background, this dark line which kind of indicates a shadow with a subtle highlight underneath it just to kind of make it look like it's slightly indented like that. And here's another one. This was a movie theater app, but lots and lots of gradient usage and inner shadows and drop shadows and kind of spotlight effects with radial gradients. But the key behind all of these is just a very subtle usage of the light and shadow combined. Last one here, this is a remote control design for the AT&T Uverse app. Now this was back before Apple TV came out. The remote is quite clunky. I don't think this is too great of a user experience, but nonetheless, we have some pretty tactile looking buttons, and all that is made possible with this idea that light is coming from the top, casting this kind of highlight on the top edge and a shadow on the bottom edge. But you have to use it gently. You have to be very subtle with it. So let's take a look at some examples of how we can actually implement this in our interfaces. Now for these lighting effects, I like to use the rule of 10 to 20, and let me show you what this means. We'll recreate a lot of these, and I just want to go over them really quickly. So this is a completely flat color, just a straight up hex code, nothing happening. And this one, you can see I've got a little bit of a gradient. You can see this linear gradient is added on top. And I've also added a bit of a text shadow here. And if you look really, really closely down here, you can see there's a tiny little drop shadow as well. And it maybe that could be a nice hover effect. And this one has the same shadow, but instead of the sharp edge down here, it almost looks like it's growing off of the screen because of this inner shadow here. And then we have a kind of a simpler version of that with a sharper edge. And then we have almost the reverse of that with this inset button, which is done with kind of a reversed gradient and then an inner shadow, which makes this background appear closer to the foreground than the actual button here. And that's really just done with a play on the colors and the shadows and this idea that light is coming from the top. So if this is behind here, it will be casting a shadow. And it's really, really similar on a dark background, but on a dark background, you can actually start to bring in this highlight, and that will kind of lift it off of the screen a little bit and give it a slightly sharper look on that top edge. And then you can also put on this bottom highlight, which kind of makes the background seem like the light is hitting that rim, that edge. So if light's coming from the top, it's casting a shadow in there, but then it's hitting that rim and making this bottom edge glow just a little bit, which kind of makes it look like this whole thing is pressed. And if you look at some practical applications inside of this My Monero project again, you can see that's exactly the same technique that I'm using on this cancel button. Now, if this was just this simple solid color gray without those lighting effects, it wouldn't look that interactive. It wouldn't have quite as much prominence. So you can imagine if I went in here and went all the way to the root layer and I took off the shadows and then I returned, and now we zoom out, it still appears to be a cancel button, and you could argue that text could be sufficient enough, and you could go with that flat style, but you might need to bump up your colors a little bit brighter for that to fully feel like a tappable, pressable, clickable button. If we go back, when we add that subtle inner shadow, this is like a 0.5 y-axis and probably like a 5 or 10% white opacity with a slightly darker background, then you can see that really just lifts the button off of the screen. And this is a style direction. This is a subjective, tactile button that lives slightly higher than the surface. And it's certainly a style decision. So if you make the style decision that some of your buttons will have a slight tactile edge to it, this is a great way to achieve that. And then for the recessed look, you can see I've got these darker gray input fields, and I've got this tiny little inner shadow, and then a tiny little white drop shadow, which creates this effect where it makes it look like it's sunk into the background and that you can actually put something into that input field. So playing with the kind of a slightly raised for the buttons and slightly pressed in for those input fields. So let's get started on kind of laying some of these foundational techniques out. So on our flat button here, this is a 50 pixel tall button on a mobile screen. I've got 20 pixels of margin on each side. And if I just want to experiment really quickly, a lot of times I'll just add another fill. And in most programs, it'll default add some type of white gradient. In Figma, this is going from 100% white down to 0% white. So where the rule of 10 to 20 comes in, I like to put my initial values at 10 or 20% for that highlight color. So 10 might be a little subtle, maybe 20 looks a little bit better. And then we can look at the difference between a button that has a slight gradient or a button that has no gradient. And you can toggle that on and off. It definitely, if you're designing for mobile, it's gonna look much different on your phone versus on your desktop app. But you can toggle that on and off with a simple little utility gradient. And if that was too light for you, if you liked maybe the darker button, you could also do the exact opposite where these colors are fully black, but then you would want the top to be 0, because remember, if we want these buttons to raise off of the background, we're going to want the light coming from the top, and we want maybe a 10 or 20% value on the very bottom. Now it looks like we could probably go with 10% instead of 20 because that black, for whatever reason, it's hitting that blue a little bit harder than the white is, and I think either one of these buttons could technically work. And you do have to mind your contrast on some of these, because if you have a color that passes but then you add this white gradient, you might need to check right in there, and what once was a passing AA color might now not be quite AA because you've added that light gradient. And that might be a reason why you add a darker gradient instead, but it really comes down to personal preference and choosing those colors. But what's cool about these linear gradients is once you have that in place, you can actually leave that gradient in place, and then you can play with a color, and that same highlight on top of it is going to be present in every instance. But you can see on some buttons it's not going to work quite as well. See, some of these darker colors are going to show that gradient a little more strongly. And if we were going to go really dark like this, we might need to go back and adjust above the 20. Even though we started here, we might need to go to 30 or 40 to have that same effect, just because there's a bit more contrast and a bit more of a rich color that doesn't react with the 10 or 20% white the same way that this would. So that's going to be a way to create these utility gradients. And sometimes when you're handing things like this off to development, or you want to explain how these are, what the fills are, a lot of times it might be a little difficult to put two different fills on an object. So one way you can recreate this exact same thing with the linear gradient. So if we wanted 0% on the top and then we have 10% on the bottom, say we wanted 20. Well, let's look at that without this linear gradient. And let's use this color as the linear gradient. So we'll change that to the linear gradient. We'll put both colors on each end of the spectrum and make sure they're both at 100%. So we've got 100% gradient of the same color going to 100% gradient of the same color. Then if you'll remember back to our color selection videos, we can adjust the brightness here to mimic a 20% black overlay, just by decreasing the brightness 20%. So 20% off of 100 is going to give us 80. And so if we have on this one a linear gradient with a 20% overlay on the bottom, and this one has a 20% darkness decrease, that's going to be the exact same look for both of these items. So you can see if I put them side by side, you can't even really see where one ends and one begins, because it's really the exact same color. Whether you overlay it as a black color or you decrease the brightness by the same amount, it's going to appear really similarly. And this would be a little bit easier to code, because then you could just say it's a linear gradient, it goes from this color to this color, versus the linear utility gradient. That can be a little bit trickier. So it's just a subtle way to kind of make that difference between the utility gradient and then these linear gradients like that. So I'll put those over there. So this one is going to be a bit of a highlight. And a lot of times, in addition to adding this linear gradient, maybe we don't want to go 30%. Let's do 20. We can also add a layer effect and do an inner shadow, change this to full white. Blur is going to give you a bit of a rounded kind of effect. Whereas if you reduce the blur to 0, it's going to give you more of a hard edge. So just looking at this, the default 25%, that's going to give you like this hard edge button that feels like it's kind of sticking out off the screen a little bit. But this is maybe a little too, maybe this feels a little weird. So a lot of times I don't like to go too high with this Y index. I might end up trying like a 1 pixel value for this Y axis, sometimes even like a 0.5. But you'll notice on this light background, it just doesn't have enough contrast with the background here to actually show up. And you'll notice that if I take the same exact button and put it on the dark background, this white overlay, this white inner shadow set to 25%, let's just do 20 and make it 1 pixel just so it's even. Look how this top edge is now popping off of that dark background. So you can't, even if I took the same exact button and put it in place of that one, so it's just not quite enough contrast for that to really work. So even though technically it might still seem like it should work with the same light, it's just not quite catching as much light there because there's not as much contrast. So most of the time on a light background, this inner highlight is not really going to work. So I will often just take that off. And you could technically, if you really wanted to, you could make this black, and you could experiment with 10% and add like a very, very subtle, almost like a stroke around the button if you wanted to. Maybe instead of an inner shadow, you did an inner stroke around the entire thing, and maybe you put that at 5%, and that could be your style. That might be the style of like a 5% stroke all the way around, and you can see that it plays slightly differently off of this top gradient than it does off the bottom. But most of the time, since light is coming from the top, we would, on these light backgrounds especially, we would probably want to give a negative value to the Y-axis, which would give it this kind of, if the light is hitting here, you can imagine that it can't quite make it to the bottom of the button. So if we put that shadow on the bottom like that, it kind of gives it this dimensionality. Like if this is the background and the button is here, we're seeing a shadow underneath the button, which makes it kind of naturally seem like it sticks out a little bit more. And you would imagine that if the button is here, and I guess I could even do it this way, the light hitting it would also cast a little bit of a shadow underneath. So in addition to a little drop inner shadow, we could place a small drop shadow, and I'm gonna start at 10%. I'll do like a 2 pixel blur and maybe a 2 pixel Y coordinate, Y axis. Maybe bump it up to 20%, see how that looks. And maybe that blur needs to be a little stronger. We'll do 4. And so now we've created this really, really subtle, very subtle linear gradient with a subtle inner shadow. And then it's also casting a small shadow. And it definitely gives a different feel, a much different feel, as opposed to removing all of this information. And there's a pretty big difference between this straight up flat button and the one with a very, very subtle 10-20% gradient with this 10 to 20% inner shadow, and then also this very, very subtle drop shadow. It just gives it just a little bit of dimensionality. And again, this is going to be highly, highly dependent on your decision for the direction that you take your app. Because to be fair, a lot of apps don't have gradient and dimensional buttons these days. You're starting to see it a little bit more, but it's almost kind of like a trend. It just comes and goes, and sometimes it's a thing, sometimes it's not, and often it could just be a branding decision. So if you do decide to do it, these are good and helpful tips. The same exact thing could happen on an input field. So if we wanted this to be inset, and actually I'll go ahead and recreate this little button over here. If we wanted it to be inset, remember if light's coming from the top and it's inset and we want to have this maybe curved effect, well, all we have to do is we could go back to our dark gradient and make sure our bottom edge is catching a little bit of light. So actually that would be 0. And then the top edge, we'll put that at 20. And then we want the entire background to appear higher than our button, even if it's this full color. So what I'm gonna do is remove this drop shadow, and this inner shadow, I want it to come from the top now. So I'm gonna put that at 2, maybe 1, and I could do a blur, maybe bump this up to 20%. But see, when I bumped that to 20%, it created this very, very sharp contrast between the background and this button. And if I take that off, especially, it's a combination of that gradient and then that shadow, and it really creates that sharp line right there, which makes this automatically feel like it's pressed into that background. And if we really want to take this to the next level, we can add a drop shadow, but instead of black, we can add white. And let's give it like a 1 pixel Y value. And let's give it 100 brightness, 100 fill. And that's gonna make this rim, the bottom rim, seem like it's just catching a little bit of light right there. And again, if your background is white, that's not gonna work. And you might even wanna go slightly darker with your background to see this effect even more clearly. So if I go really dark, that's kind of a weird color combination, but at least it lets you see that white edge. So if you're going a little bit lighter, like right in this range, maybe then the 100% white drop shadow, that could be too much. Maybe you go 90, 80, but you're still kind of in that 10 to 20% range from full value. But it's just kind of a subtle play between that background color and that inner rim right there. And the same recess technique could work on input fields. Say we've got an input field here, and maybe this isn't quite as rounded, and instead of this blue color, maybe we have full white, and instead of white text. Let's make this black. So you can tell that just changing that, like this is not a very nice looking input field. So a lot of times what I might do is just kind of strip these off just to see what it looks like without anything. And a lot of times it's hard to make a white input field look set back into the background. And so sometimes you might want your input field to be a little bit darker than the actual background. And that will naturally make it a little bit easier on yourself. So if I added that same background color as a fill, and then I can just nudge this down a few times until you can barely start to see a difference. We can also use our HSB trick and knock down the brightness a bit. But once I have a pretty good base like that, then I can bring in the inner shadow. And maybe that's a little bit too dark, or maybe you just need to experiment with that. Maybe I want it to be a little bit more subtle. 10 to 20% still is a good range to try out. And then maybe I bring in that white drop shadow there. And so that's starting to look a little bit more like an input field. But one thing that's going to make this look a little bit better will be this darker gradient coming back in. And again, I want to be in the 10 to 20%. I want to start really, really subtle and see how that looks. And that looks okay, but I think this black is not quite working that well. So a lot of times I might even try the linear gradient where I'm using the exact same hex codes, and then I might just kind of make that top one a little bit darker. But remember, we're at 10% here, so maybe we bump that to 20, then we go a little darker. Maybe we go 30, just kind of play with it a little bit. But you can see this definitely gives you a certain type of style, and maybe this is too much. Maybe this is too much for an input field, and you might be better off with white input fields with a lot of times, simpler can be much better. Maybe you just have a white input field with a subtle drop shadow, and maybe that's what your input fields look like. But again, I would still play, if I'm dealing with depth and lighting, I'd be tempted to play around in that 10 to 20% range. Play around with the Y-axis and the blur. But you could also imagine, what if this was, instead of a big button, what if this was 24 by 24 and maybe the corner radius was 4 or so? That could be a pretty nice little checkbox. And you could also, another thing you could do is add a fill of black to this and make that 10%. And those inner shadows and the drop shadows and all that, those are still going to work the same way that they would on that gradient. You just might have to play around with toning things down a little bit, or if you add a little bit more of a blur, it's going to seem a little bit darker and deeper of an indentation. So a lot of subtle things that you can play with here. And you can kind of make it feel like it's just barely pressed in. Something like that. Again, you can also pick that same background color, and then maybe you just go a little darker with it like that. So you could imagine this being like a recessed checkbox, and then when it gets filled, maybe you get a style like this. So this would be the deselected. And if I Command Option C this button background and then hit Command Option V, that's going to paste that style, including the border radius. So I'd change that back. This might be the selected version of that with your white check mark inside of it. However you want to do that. Your little check mark. So pull in a check mark icon. But just subtle little techniques with the inner shadows. And this white shadow is going to make things on the bottom look like it's recessed. Whereas on dark backgrounds, you can use that really to an extreme to make this just really have a crisp top edge. Even if you don't want to go with a really gradient, rounded, skeuomorphic button, it can just add a nice little sharp pop to some of those elements. And lastly, look inside of this Cinesampler app. You can see that I'm using that same exact technique with my 10% white on top of these. And then I've got my pretty dark shadow just to make these pop off the background a little bit. And then these grooves right here where you can slide the volume. You can see the groove here. It's a darker color with this 1 pixel inner shadow. And then I have a very, very subtle blurry drop shadow, which makes it kind of seem a little bit like an indented and then kind of rounded, like it's catching the light on the bottom. And those subtle little things just kind of make these little tiny elements just pop off the screen a little bit more. And that way they just seem a little bit more like this is volume and sliders and you're controlling real world instruments. And it just, to me, it provided like a nice contrast with a lot of this flat UI and these very, very subtle tactile details and things like that. Just kind of give it a nice richness that you would not have if everything was just completely flat. Even if you look at these title bars on these desktop apps, if you look really, really closely, you can see a white highlight on the top here, and it's got a lighter gradient. And look at these buttons, they're casting a little bit of a shadow here. And a lot of desktop type applications are still using a very subtle amount of this light technique coming from the top, casting a shadow. So it's still prevalent, it's still highly relevant to interfaces, whether or not you're going with a flat UI or not. Every now and then you'll come across a pattern or component that has that applicable depth, lighting, and shadow kind of techniques that can be implemented on that. So for your depth homework, I want you to grab this file and just kind of study the way that some of these gradients and shadows are created on various backgrounds, the dark backgrounds, the light backgrounds. And once you've kind of dug through some of these concepts, go ahead and try to create your own versions of these, different colors, maybe they're different size buttons. Just create like a light mode and a dark mode and see how you can toggle that bottom drop white shadow to make it seem recessed, or have these buttons that are popping off the screen with a subtle little white highlight, and play around with those 10% values, 10%, 20%, 30%. And you'll notice like on a yellow button, for example, you might need 100% white on that top edge, but that would never work on a really dark red button because it would just be too strong. So play with those subtle, experiment with the light, the shadow, the raised buttons, the recessed buttons and input fields, and just kind of learn how you can start to apply these techniques in some of your own projects.